Once the bandages had been cut away from the chest area, it was possible to see the arms.
From covering furniture legs to throwing mummy unwrapping parties, the Victorians were no stranger to bizarre trends. Let's dive into some of the most unusual fads that define this eccentric period in history. Number 30. Mummy unwrapping parties. Mummy unwrapping parties. Yes, these were a thing. During the height of Egyptomania in the 19th century, wealthy Victorians would gather for what can only be described as the creepiest party trend of all time. Someone would bring back a mummy from a trip to Egypt, and instead of respectfully preserving it, they'd invite their friends over to unwrap it like a Christmas present. These parties were often held in private homes, but sometimes even in public venues, where the unwrapping became a grotesque form of entertainment. The mummies were treated as little more than ancient curiosities, with no regard for the cultural or spiritual significance they held. Today, the idea of a mummy unwrapping party is rightfully seen as barbaric and exploitive, but in Victorian England, it was just another way for the rich to entertain themselves. Number 29. Pet monkeys and exotic animals. Owning a pet is one thing, but for the upper-class Victorians, pet monkeys and exotic animals were the ultimate status symbol. Queen Victoria herself had a menagerie of animals, including 88 dogs over her lifetime, and wild parrots and monkeys were all the rage among the wealthy. Imported from Britain's colonies, these animals weren't just pets.
Pets became socially acceptable, which is very evident from paintings and architecture from that time.
They were living proof of the owner's wealth and power. Of course, most of these animals were poorly cared for and didn't live long in their new foreign environments, but that didn't stop the trend. For the Victorians, owning an exotic animal was like driving the latest sports car today. It was all about showing off. The fad eventually faded as people realized that maybe keeping wild animals in their homes wasn't the best idea. But for a brief period, exotic pets were the height of upper-class fashion. Number 28. Electrotherapy. In the Victorian era, people believed in the healing powers of electricity. Enter electrotherapy, where doctors shocked patients to treat everything from headaches to emotional distress. You had weak muscles? Zap. Gout? Zap. Feeling anxious? Zap. Time for a jolt of electricity. Women in particular were often subjected to these treatments for behaviors like wanting time alone to read or paint, basically for not fitting into the expected social mold. The upper class, obsessed with health and newfangled technologies, thought they were on the cutting edge of medical science. Spoiler alert, electrotherapy didn't work, and most of these treatments were completely ineffective, sometimes even harmful. But for a while, electrotherapy was all the rage, with wealthy Victorians lining up for their electric cures. It's a reminder that not every new technology is the miracle it's made out to be. Number 27. Puzzle craze. In the 1880s, people went nuts over a simple sliding puzzle called the 15 puzzle. It was a grid with 15 numbered tiles in one empty space.
Oh, that's the downside of the magnetic system. If I move one cell, everything is fine, but if I want to move 3 of them...
And the goal was to slide the tiles around until they were in numerical order. Sounds harmless, right? Wrong. Factories had to ban the puzzle because workers were spending all their time playing with it. People became so obsessed that they would spend hours trying to solve it, ignoring their jobs and responsibilities. The 15 puzzle craze was so disruptive that it became one of the first examples of a productivity killer. Eventually, the fad died down as new distractions came along, but for a brief period, the 15 puzzle was the 19th century version of the smartphone. Distracting, addictive, and impossible to put down. Number 26. Black servants as fashion accessories. The 18th century aristocracy had a disturbing trend. Fashionable ladies would keep young black boys as servants and fashion accessories. This was the height of colonialism, where wealth and power were flaunted through human ownership. These boys, often dressed in lavish outfits to match their mistresses, weren't seen as people, but as symbols of luxury and status. The fact that this was a trend is horrifying, but it's also a stark reminder of the grotesque ways people justified slavery and colonialism. As abolitionist movements gained momentum, this disturbing practice faded out, but the legacy of this human commodification still lingers. This is one trend the world is better off forgetting, but it serves as a grim chapter in fashion history. Number 25, turtle strolling. Picture this. You're a 19th century French hipster, a flaneur if you will, strolling through Paris at the slowest possible pace. But you're not alone. No, you're walking a turtle. Yes, an actual turtle, on a leash. Why?
He loves going outside. He's downstairs in the tank, and when I take him out...
Because in the world of the flaneur, a turtle symbolizes the ultimate slow-paced, leisurely lifestyle. It was peak irony. The flaneur believed in taking life at a turtle's speed, wandering aimlessly and observing the city's details. The turtle was more than a pet. It was a walking or crawling embodiment of the philosophy of flaneurie. The trend didn't last long. Let's be real. Turtles aren't great for long walks. But for a brief moment, they were the ultimate hipster accessory. It's hard to imagine today's influencers swapping their designer dogs for a turtle. But hey, 19th century France was a strange place indeed. Number 24, Victorian headless portraits. Imagine getting your portrait taken without your head. Sounds bizarre, right? Well, in the mid-19th century, Victorian headless portraits were all the rage. People would pose for photos where it looked like their heads had been removed, often holding them in their hands or placing them on a table next to their bodies. It was an eerie and surreal trend that reflected the Victorians' fascination with death and the supernatural. These portraits were a way for people to indulge in the macabre while having a bit of fun. But like all fads, the novelty wore off. By the end of the century, headless portraits were a thing of the past. Today, they're mostly a curiosity, a strange relic of a time when people found humor in pretending to be decapitated.
And I really do think these images are testament to the awesome sense of humor of these people.
It's just another example of the weirdness that can take hold when society collectively loses its mind. Number 23, railway mania. The 1840s saw Britain in a frenzy over railways. Railway mania wasn't just a bubble, it was a full-blown national obsession. Everyone and their dog was investing in railway companies, convinced they were about to make a fortune. The problem? People were throwing money into schemes that had no hope of ever turning a profit. Speculators pumped the market until it popped, leaving thousands of investors bankrupt. It was a cautionary tale for all future bubbles. Don't buy into the hype. Railways revolutionized travel, sure, but the people who invested in the wrong companies were left holding nothing but worthless shares. It's a classic example of FOMO, fear of missing out, on a grand scale. Railway mania burned out quickly, and while railroads survived, the fortunes of the mania's investors did not, a trend that made and broke so many. Number 22, Egyptian revival. When the British discovered the tombs of ancient Egypt, it set off a wave of fascination with all things Egyptian. From architecture to fashion, the Egyptian revival of the 19th century saw people adopting Egyptian motifs for everything. You'd find Egyptian-style obelisks in gardens.
An entrance forecourt leads to the imposing facade formed as a pylon, measuring 36 meters wide and 32 meters high.
Pyramids and cemeteries, and even jewelry inspired by ancient designs. For a time, being Egyptian chic was the height of fashion. This wasn't just in Britain. Earlier, Egyptian and American societies were gripped by the craze. But like all fads, it eventually lost its appeal, especially as other trends came along. Today, Egyptian revival is mostly remembered by historians or antique collectors, and it's far removed from its days as the hottest trend around. Still, it was a fascinating glimpse into how ancient cultures can capture the modern imagination. Number 21, companion monkeys. In the early 20th century, rich New Yorkers got into one of the strangest fads, carrying around monkeys in their muff hand warmers. Think about that. Monkeys, dressed up in little outfits, roaming the upper-class streets of Manhattan. It wasn't just a trend, it was a statement. The elite couldn't get enough of these exotic pets, with thousands of them being imported to the city. But let's be real. Was this about the animals? No, it was about status, pure and simple. Having a monkey in your muff was like walking around with a diamond necklace. It screamed, "I have money to burn." This fad didn't last long, though. As more people joined in, the allure faded, and by the 1910s, you were more likely to see a companion dog than a monkey.
In one respect, Wellington has now caught up to London. It has a daily chimpanzee's tea party.
And today, it's one of those bizarre trends nobody talks about. Why? Because it's weird. Seriously, monkeys in hand warmers? Not exactly a legacy anyone's proud of. Number 20, South Sea Bubble. People living in 1720 were losing their minds over shares in the South Sea Company. It was supposed to be the next big thing, riches beyond your wildest dreams. Except it wasn't. People piled their money into it, believing they were on the brink of unimaginable wealth. But here's the kicker, it was all a scam. The stock prices skyrocketed, and then, just like that, they plummeted. Thousands were left destitute, and the whole thing turned out to be one of the biggest financial disasters of the century. People were conned, plain and simple. It's hard to imagine today's tech bubble being this blatantly corrupt, but maybe we shouldn't be so sure. The South Sea Bubble remains as one of the earliest examples of people being suckered by promises of quick wealth. And as usual, a select few at the top walked away rich, while everyone else paid the price. Number 19, Orchidolarium. It sounds ridiculous, but in the 19th century, people literally lost their minds over orchids. This wasn't just some casual plant-loving hobby, it was an obsession. Wealthy Europeans poured insane amounts of money into collecting these rare flowers. Orchidolarium was driven by an almost cult-like devotion to these exotic plants. People trekked into dangerous jungles just to get their hands on a new species of orchid. They paid fortunes to keep them alive in their homes.
Yes, me and Brenda have been friends for a long time, and it'll be exciting to have her back in the...
showcasing them as symbols of wealth and status. But here's the catch. The orchids weren't always easy to cultivate, and many of them died. The trend lasted for decades, but like most fads, it eventually fizzled out. What's left? Today's orchid collectors seem tame compared to the madness of the 1800s. Orchidolarium was a bizarre chapter in history where the rich would go to any lengths for a plant, no matter the cost. Number 18, dancing mania. Here's a trend you won't believe. For centuries, people across Europe would literally dance until they dropped. No, this wasn't some medieval rave. It was a phenomenon known as dancing mania. Entire towns would suddenly be overtaken by a compulsive urge to dance. It wasn't just a few people. Sometimes hundreds of people would dance non-stop for days, often collapsing from exhaustion or even dying. Theories for this madness range from mass hysteria to ergo poisoning, a fungus that can cause hallucinations. But nobody really knows why it happened. The crazy part? It didn't just happen once. For centuries, outbreaks of dancing mania would pop up in different parts of Europe with no clear explanation. It's one of those historical quirks that made you wonder what on earth was going on back then. Could you imagine something like this happening today?
And could only explain it as the result of a thing they called hot blood. They thought it was somewhat similar to a fever.
Maybe, but it'd probably be on TikTok instead of on the streets. Number 17, the Macarena. The 90s, where things like the Macarena somehow took over the world. For a few glorious years, this song and its accompanying dance became an inescapable part of pop culture. School dances, weddings, corporate events, you name it. The Macarena was there. It's the ultimate example of a one-hit wonder that no one could escape from. Everyone thought that they were in on the fun, but deep down, they probably wondered why they were doing this silly dance. But like all fads, it was fun while it lasted, and then it disappeared. The Macarena isn't something anyone brags about today. Try bringing it up at a party now, and you'll likely get some awkward laughs or eye rolls. But at its peak, you couldn't go anywhere without seeing people line up and do the dance. Looking back, it's kind of hard to explain how we all fell for it. Number 16. Alfred E. Newman. Who? Me? If you were around in the mid-20th century, this gap-toothed, big-eared cartoon face would have been instantly recognizable. Alfred E. Newman became the mascot for Mad magazine, a satirical publication that poked fun at pretty much everything. Newman's face, often accompanied by the tagline, "What, me worry?" became a cultural icon.
But instead he wears a Chuck Taylor-like red sneakers with a Superman emblem on the inner side.
He was everywhere, on t-shirts, posters, and in the minds of anyone trying to figure out what the heck was going on with society. But like most fads, his popularity waned. Today, Alfred E. Newman feels like a relic from a bygone era when magazines were the go-to for cultural commentary. You don't see this smug, clueless grin anymore. But for a while, he was the face of American irreverence. Try mentioning him to a Gen Z kid today, though. You'll probably just get a blank stare. Number 15. Beanie Baby collecting. You could argue the 1990s were peak insanity when it came to fads, but nothing compares to the Beanie Baby craze. People genuinely believed these little stuffed animals were going to make them rich. They weren't just toys, they were investments. The value of Beanie Babies soared as collectors scrambled to get their hands on rare editions, believing the plush toys would be worth a fortune one day. Spoiler alert, they weren't. The bubble burst hard, and those who spent thousands on a stuffed bear were left with, well, a stuffed bear. What's crazy is how deep this fad went. People would wait in line for hours, drop insane amounts of cash, and even fight each other to grab the latest release. Today, Beanie Babies are almost forgotten, a relic of misguided 19s consumerism.
That it's over.
So is it official?
It's official. Shop owner Joe Diamond had to post the news.
Beanie Babies are dead.
It's a lesson in hype culture and how quickly a sure thing can turn into nothing. Number 14, Bruceploitation, 1970s. After Bruce Lee died in 1973, the world was hungry for more martial arts action, and studios capitalized on that by creating an entire genre of films called Bruceploitation. The formula was simple. Hire actors who looked vaguely like Bruce Lee, give them similar names, and have them fight in ridiculous, over-the-top kung fu films. The trend lasted through the 1970s and even spilled into the early 1980s. It was all about cashing in on Bruce Lee's name without any real connection to his work or legacy. Some of these films were unintentionally hilarious too, with poor production values, cheesy dialogue, and fight scenes that were more slapstick than serious. Bruceploitation fizzled out eventually, though, as audiences grew tired of the copycats, and the genre disappeared into obscurity. Today, it's a forgotten chapter in cinema history, remembered more for its absurdity than anything else. Number 13, Kilroy was here. During World War II, soldiers began scribbling, "Kilroy was here" all over the place, usually accompanied by a little drawing of a bald guy peeking over a wall. No one knows exactly where it started, but the graffiti spread like wildfire.
The tag even made an appearance at the Potsdam Conference, a post-World War II meeting between U.S. President Harry Truman, UK Prime Minister.
It was everywhere, on ships, planes, barracks, and even in enemy territory. The whole thing became an inside joke, a way for soldiers to say, "We've been here." It was the ultimate meme before the internet existed. The phrase had a kind of mythical quality, almost like Kilroy was some omnipresent figure showing up wherever the action was. After the war, the trend died down, but for a few years, Kilroy was literally everywhere. Today, it's a bit of a wartime trivia, something history buffs know about, but most people have forgotten. In its heyday, though, Kilroy was as famous as any celebrity was. Number 12, Pineapple Mania. Yes, pineapples. In the 18th century, they were the status symbol. Think about it. Pineapples were rare, expensive, and difficult to get. So, what did the wealthy do? Well, they rented pineapples. That's right. Pineapple Mania saw rich people renting a single fruit just to show it off at parties. It wasn't even about eating them. It was about being seen with one. Displaying a pineapple at your dinner party was like driving a Ferrari today. The trend was so absurd that people even bought ceramic pineapples when they couldn't afford the real thing. But as transportation improved and pineapples became more available, the craze fizzled out.
So very carefully, with a sharp knife, you basically need to remove the flesh of the pineapple from the shell.
Pineapples went from being an exotic luxury to just another fruit. But for a brief time, having a pineapple made you the center of attention in 18th century society. Ridiculous? Absolutely. But that's how trends go. Here today, gone tomorrow. Number 11, plank road boom. Let's visit the mid-19th century. Roads were a mess, muddy, impassable for months. Enter the plank road boom, where everyone thought laying down wooden planks for roads would revolutionize travel. It was seen as the future of infrastructure. Investors were convinced they were onto something big, so they dumped their money into building these wooden highways across states. For a while, it worked. Travel was easier, and businesses boomed along these roadsides. But, spoiler alert, wood rots. The maintenance costs skyrocketed, and soon these modern roads became useless. People lost fortunes as the whole system literally fell apart. By the end of the 19th century, plank roads were a thing of the past. They were replaced by more durable infrastructure. But for a brief, shining moment, everyone thought wooden planks would pave the way to the future. Funny how that worked out. Number 10, pterodomania. You know people who go crazy for succulents? Well, in the mid-1800s, that was ferns. Pterodomania, or fern madness, was a full-on craze. Ferns were the go-to plant for Victorians, who decorated their homes with them, pressed them into books, or even wore fern patterns on their clothes. It wasn't just a hobby, it was an obsession. Entire books were written about ferns, and people would hike through the wilderness just to find a rare variety. Victorians built special glass cases called Wardian cases just to house their precious ferns. But, like all fads, it burned out. By the late 19th century, pterodomania was a distant memory, and the once precious ferns were left to gather dust. Today, ferns are just another plant, but during pterodomania, they were practically royalty. It's wild to think that a humble plant could spark such madness, but that's the Victorians for you. Number 9, sideburns. Before beards and mustaches were cool, there were sideburns. In the mid-19th century, men took this facial hair trend to absurd levels. It was all about the sideburns, thick, bushy, and as long as you could grow them. General Ambrose Burnside, a Union Army general during the Civil War, popularized the look, which became known as sideburns after his name. The bigger the sideburns, the more manly you appeared. It wasn't just facial hair, it was a status symbol. But like all fashion trends, it eventually wore out of style. By the late 19th century, clean-shaven faces were back in vogue, and sideburns became a thing of the past. Today, they're mostly remembered as a relic of old-time masculinity, and while some people still rock the look, sideburns will never reclaim their former glory. Number 8, sunspottery. In the late 1800s, scientists and amateur astronomers became obsessed with sunspots.
Diameter, whereas the solar scope is slightly larger at 3.5 inches. Also, because the solar...
Yep, sunspottery was a real thing. People were convinced that these dark spots on the sun held the key to understanding everything from the weather to global economies. Entire scientific careers were built around studying these tiny solar anomalies. Sunspot theories popped up in newspapers, and some people even believed they could predict economic booms and busts based on the sun's activities. It was like astrology, but with science. Of course, none of it panned out. Sunspots are fascinating, but they're not the mystical key to the universe some believe them to be. By the early 20th century, sunspottery had faded into obscurity, but for a brief time, people thought the answers to the world's biggest mysteries were written on the face of the sun. Number 7, tangram. Ever played with a tangram? If not, you're not alone. In the 19th century, these Chinese puzzles became a global sensation. They were simple, 7 flat pieces that you had to arrange into different shapes. Sounds easy? Right. Wrong. Tangrams were mind-bendingly difficult, and people became obsessed with mastering them. For a while, it seemed like everyone was trying to outdo each other by creating the most complex designs. Tangram books were published, and the puzzles made their way into parlors across Europe and America. But like all fads, the novelty wore off. By the early 20th century, tangrams were just another forgotten puzzle. Today, you might still find one in a dusty corner of a toy store, but tangram mania is long gone. It's just another example of how something so simple can capture the public's imagination for a brief moment before fading away. Number 6. Tiki culture. Remember the mid-1950s when everything suddenly went tropical? Tiki culture swept across America like a tropical storm, starting with bars and restaurants that embraced Polynesian themes. Exotic drinks served in carved mugs, island-inspired music, and bamboo decor spread like wildfire. People weren't just sipping Mai Tais, they were turning their homes into miniature tropical paradises. And it didn't stop there. The tiki aesthetic seeped into fashion, architecture, and even music. But here's the kicker. This wasn't about Polynesia. It was a Hollywood-crafted fantasy sold to middle-class Americans looking for escapism. By the 1970s, though, the tiki craze had disappeared. Its kitschy charm was no longer in style, replaced by more modern, minimalist tastes. What remains today? Some retro bars and ironic nods to the era. But tiki culture is now just a quirky footnote in American history. Number 5. Phrenology. You've heard of reading palms, right? But have you heard about reading skulls? Well, that was the essence of phrenology, a 19th century pseudoscience where people believed the shape of your skull could determine your personality, intelligence, or even your criminal tendencies. Want to know if someone was a genius or a psychopath? Just measure their head. It was all nonsense, of course, but for a while, phrenology was taken very seriously. People would pay to have their skulls examined, and phrenological readings were even used in job interviews and court cases. By the late 19th century, science debunked phrenology as quackery.
Using consistent biological terminology, phrenological thinking became influential in the
But its influence on early psychology and even eugenics left a dark legacy. Today, phrenology is just another example of how far people will go to believe they can read someone's mind by looking at their head. Number 4. Alchemy. We've all heard about turning lead into gold, but that was just the tip of the iceberg for alchemy. This ancient practice wasn't just about making gold, it was about discovering the secrets of the universe. Alchemists believed they could transmute materials, create elixirs of immortality, and even communicate with metaphysical entities. It sounds bizarre now, but for centuries, alchemy was seen as a serious field of study, blending science with mysticism. Kings and queens funded alchemists, hoping they'd unlock the secret to eternal life or infinite wealth. Of course, none of it worked. By the 18th century, alchemy had been largely discredited, replaced by modern chemistry. But for a long time, alchemists were the rock stars of their day.
Stone's wisdom was lost over time, and by the Middle Ages, the concept of metal transmutation and the race to create the philosophy,
promising miracles and occasionally blowing up their labs in the process. Number 3. World War II Pacific Island influence. After World War II, American soldiers returning from the Pacific brought back idealized visions of island life. Anthropological works like Margaret Mead's Coming of Age in Samoa also fed into this post-war fascination. The result? A booming interest in anything resembling the South Pacific. It influenced everything from fashion to home decor. People wanted to believe in the laid-back, carefree lifestyle they'd seen, or thought they had seen, during the war. This obsession with tropical paradises was closely linked to the birth of tiki culture and the whole escape to an island mentality. But like most trends, it was more about fantasy than reality. The idealized version of island life that Americans latched onto had little to do with the actual cultures they were borrowing from. Today, this romanticized view of the Pacific is mostly remembered through retro decor and kitschy tiki bars, a fleeting glimpse of post-war optimism. Number 2. Covering table and piano legs. Yes, you read that right. Victorians were so prudish that even the sight of a table or piano leg was enough to scandalize them. During the 19th century, covering furniture legs became a bizarre yet widespread trend among the upper class. The reasoning? Uncovered legs were seen as suggestive, even sexual.
Room had been papered in green. Tests on the wallpaper found 3 grains of arsenic per square foot.
Some people were so offended by the sight of a table leg, they would kick it or turn away in disgust. It's hard to imagine now, but back then, people literally went out of their way to cover up something as innocent as a piano leg. The prudishness of the Victorian era knew no bounds. Of course, this was about more than just furniture. It reflected a broader cultural anxiety around modesty, sexuality, and propriety. But really, covering up table legs? It's just one of those strange historical quirks that makes you thankful we've moved on. Number 1, Egyptomania. The Victorians had a major thing for Egypt. The term Egyptomania perfectly captures the obsession that swept through the upper classes during the 19th century. After Napoleon's invasion of Egypt and the subsequent discoveries of ancient tombs, wealthy Brits couldn't get enough of all things Egyptian. They traveled to the Nile, bought mummies as souvenirs, and hosted mummy unwrapping parties as entertainment for their guests. That's right, they would gather around as someone unwrapped a real ancient mummy, treating it like some kind of Victorian spectacle. It was all a part of a broader fascination with death, mystery, and the exotic. But let's be clear, this wasn't about appreciating ancient cultures. It was about pure colonialist indulgence, taking artifacts and remains for personal amusement. Today, it's seen as a creepy and disrespectful trend, but back then, it was just another way for the rich to show off. The Victorian era, known for its technological advancements and strict social norms, was also home to some of the strangest trends in history. Covering table and piano legs might seem absurd now, but in a society obsessed with modesty, even the sight of a furniture leg was deemed inappropriate. And let's not forget the fascination with electrotherapy, where Victorians believed that electric shocks could cure everything from headaches to emotional distress. The era's obsession with exoticism manifested in Egyptomania, where wealthy travelers brought back mummies and hosted macabre unwrapping parties as if it were a form of entertainment. But the Victorians didn't stop at strange medical practices or morbid curiosities. Fashion played a role too, with corsets becoming so restrictive that they physically damaged women's bodies. Even the trend of keeping exotic pets like monkeys and parrots reflected the empire's rich and the upper class's desire to showcase their wealth.